The sun was merciless that August afternoon in 1887, beating down on the dusty trail that wound alongside the Snake River in what would someday become Idaho Territory. Thomas Hartley wiped the sweat from his brow with torn sleeve, his horse stumbling slightly under the... He was a man with nothing left to lose, riding toward a future as uncertain as the shifting. But what Thomas didn't know was that this scorching day would change everything. In exactly 37 minutes, he would make a decision that seemed insignificant at the time, sharing his last piece of bread with a stranger. What he couldn't possibly imagine was that this simple act of kindness would unlock secrets that had been buried for decades, secrets that would make him one of the most powerful men in the territory. Thomas had been traveling for 3 days since leaving the mining camp at Silver Creek, where his dreams of striking it rich had crumbled like fool's gold in his calloused hands. The other miners had mocked him when he'd finally given up, calling him a quitter, but Thomas knew better. He'd seen too many good men lose their minds chasing shadows, dark times. Better to start fresh somewhere else, even if it meant traveling with nothing but the clothes on his back and a few days' worth of hardtack bread. The river curved ahead, and Thomas guided his horse toward the shade of a massive cottonwood tree. The animal needed rest, and truthfully, so did he. As he dismounted, something caught his eye near the water's edge. A figure sat hunched over, partially hidden by the tall grass and reeds. At first, he thought it might be another traveler, but as he approached, he realized it was a woman. She appeared to be in her 50s, with steel-gray hair that had once been carefully arranged but now hung loose and tangled around her shoulders. Her dress, though well-made, was covered in dust and showed signs of hard travel. Most striking were her hands. They shook slightly as she cupped water from the river, and Thomas noticed they bore the calluses of someone who had known real work, despite the quality of her clothing. "Ma'am," Thomas called, not wanting to startle her. "Are you in need of assistance?" The woman looked up, and Thomas was struck by her. They were sharp and intelligent, the kind that had seen much of the world. But there was something else there, too. A weariness that spoke of recent hardship. "I'm quite all right, thank you," she replied, her voice carrying the refined accent of someone educated back. But her stomach chose that moment to betray her with a loud rumble that echoed across the water. Thomas felt a familiar pang in his chest. He'd known hunger himself, real hunger, the kind that made a man's hands shake and his vision blur. Without hesitation, he reached into his saddlebag and withdrew his remaining bread, wrapped carefully in a piece of cloth. "When did you last eat, ma'am?" he asked. The woman's pride flickered across her face, a candle in the wind. "That's very kind of you to ask, but I couldn't possibly—" "Please," interrupted, extending the bread toward her. "I insist. My mother always said that food shared tastes better than food eaten alone." For a moment the woman simply stared at the offered. Then, as if something inside her had cracked, her composure wavered. I haven't eaten in 2 days." Thomas immediately broke the bread in half, keeping the smaller portion himself. "Then we'll share it properly. A meal always goes down easier with good company." As they sat together by the river, sharing the simple fare, the woman began to speak. Her name was Margaret Donovan, and she had been traveling alone for nearly a week. She didn't elaborate on why she was alone or where she was headed, but Thomas didn't press. Everyone in the West had their reasons for moving on, and most of those reasons were best left unspoken. "You're very kind, Mr. Margaret inquired. "Hartley? Thomas Hartley. And kindness doesn't cost a man anything, Mrs. Donovan. Though I notice you're not wearing a wedding ring." Margaret's hand moved instinctively to her ring finger, where a pale band of skin showed where a ring had been. "It's Miss Donovan now." They talked about the weather, the difficult journey, the changing face of the territory. Margaret was well-spoken and clearly educated, but there was something guarded about her responses. She asked more questions than she answered, and Thomas found himself telling her about his failed mining venture, his plans to start fresh, maybe find work on one of the big ranches that were starting to spring up. Ranching is hard work, but honest work. There's something to be said for that. "You speak as if you know something about it, Thomas." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the river flow. "I've seen my share of ranch ops. Some run with integrity, others—" She trailed off, shaking her head. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas found himself reluctant to continue his journey. There was something about this woman that intrigued him. She carried herself with the bearing of someone accustomed to authority, yet here she was, alone and apparently without resource. But more than that, there was a sadness about her that touched something deep in his chest. "Miss Donovan," he said finally, "if you don't mind my asking, what brings you to be traveling alone in such a remote area?" Margaret's expression darkened. "I'm afraid that's a rather long and unpleasant story, Mr. Hartley. Not the sort of thing to burden a kind stranger with. I've got time, and sometimes talking helps lighten the—" Margaret studied his face for a long moment, as if weighing whether to trust him. Finally she sighed. "Very well. But I warn you, it's not a tale that speaks well of human nature." Paused, gathering her thoughts. "I was, until very recently, a woman of some means. My late father built a considerable empire in this territory, cattle ranches, mining operations, timber rights. When he passed 5 years ago, he left everything to me." Thomas's eyebrows rose. It was unusual, though not unheard of, for a father to leave his entire estate to a daughter, rather than seeking out a male heir. "My father was a progressive in many ways," Margaret continued, reading his. "He believed that competence mattered more than gender, and I had proven myself capable of managing his business interest. What happened? Though he says he already knew that it was heading. My cousin, Harold Donovan, felt differently about a woman controlling. He'd been contesting the will since the day it was read, claiming my father wasn't of sound mind when he wrote it. For 5 years I fought him in court, spending a fortune on lawyers, but last month—" her voice cracked slightly, "last month he found a judge who was sympathetic to, or perhaps more a judge who was sympathetic to his wallet." Thomas felt a familiar anger building. He'd seen plenty of men who that might made right, that the strong had the privilege. It was one of the reasons he'd left civilization behind to try his in the mine. "So he took everything?" Thomas said. "Everything, Margaret. The house, the land, the businesses, even my personal belongings were declared part of the estate. I was given 24 hours to vacate the property, nothing but the clothes on my—" "That's not justice," Thomas said quietly, his jaw clenched. "No, it's not. But it's the law, apparently. At least, it's Harold's version of the law." Margaret's eyes flashed with anger. "Do you know what the worst part is? I built that empire as much as my father did. For 15 years I worked alongside him, learning every aspect of the business. I knew every ranch hand, every mine foreman, every timber crew chief. I knew which operations were profitable and which were bleeding money. I knew—" She stopped, as if realizing she was revealing more than she intended. "You knew the business better than your cousin ever could. Harold hasn't set foot on any of the properties in years. He lives in San Francisco, playing the part of a gentleman investor. He has no idea how to actually run a ranch or manage a mining operation." Margaret's voice grew bitter. "Mark my words, within a year he'll have run everything into the ground." They sat in silence, both. Finally Thomas, "Where will you go now?" "I don't know. I had hoped to reach Portland, find some kind of work there. I have some education, perhaps I'd find a position as a governess or a teacher, but the journey is longer than I anticipate, and my resources are—" She gestured helpless or dusty. Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. "Miss Donovan, I don't have much, but I have enough supplies for both of us. If you'd accept the company, I'd be honored to escort you." Margaret stared at "Mr. Hartley, you don't even know me. Why would you—" "Because it's the right thing, and because I've got a feeling that there's more to your story than what you've told me." Something flickered in Margaret's hope, or maybe just surprise at finding unexpected kindness in a harsh word. "There is more, much more, but some secrets are dangerous. Some knowledge can put a person in considerable peril." "What kind of secrets?" Forward. Margaret hesitated, then seemed to make a decision. "The kind that could get us both shot. If the wrong people found out I'd spoken of." Despite the warmth of the afternoon, Thomas felt a chill run down. "Miss Donovan, what exactly did your father's empire consist of?" "Officially, cattle ranches, 3 mining operations, and logging rights to several thousand acres of timberland." Margaret's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Unofficially? My father discovered something in the mountains west of here. Something that Harold doesn't know about because I made sure it was never recorded in any legal document." Thomas's heart began to race. What kind of discovery? Margaret looked around nervously, as if expecting Harold or his men to emerge from the brush at any moment. "Silver, Mr. Hartley. Not just a vein or a pocket, but an entire mountain honeycomb with silver ore. Enough silver to make the discoveries at Comstock look like a child's allowance." The magnitude of what she was saying hit Thomas like a physical blow. The Comstock lode in Nevada had been one of the richest silver discoveries in history, creating fortunes that had shaped the entire American West. If Margaret was telling the truth, why didn't your father register the claim? Thomas asked, because he was smart enough to know what would happen if word got out. This territory would be overrun with prospectors, claim jumpers, and every sort of dangerous character you can imagine. My father preferred to extract the silver quietly, a little at a time, shipping it out through various intermediaries. It provided a steady income without attracting unwanted attention. And you continued his methods? For 5 years, yes. The silver was what allowed me to fight Harold's legal challenges for so long. But now, Margaret's voice trailed off. Now Harold has legal control of all your father's properties, including the mountain with the silver. Except he doesn't know it's there, with a slight. The mine isn't marked on any official survey. On paper, it's just worthless wilderness, and I'm the only person alive who knows exactly where it is. Thomas felt his mind racing. This changed everything. If Margaret was telling the truth, then she hadn't lost everything after. She still had access to a fortune beyond imagination. Miss Donovan said carefully, "Why are you telling me this?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying. "Because, Mr. Hartley, I've been watching you. You shared your last piece of bread with Ranger. You offered to escort me to safety without asking for anything. You listened to my story without judgment, got angry on my behalf when I told you about the injustice I'd suffered. In my experience, men who show such character in small matters with larger ones. What are you proposing?" Though his heart was already pounding. "I'm proposing a partnership. I know where the silver is, but I can't get to it alone. Harold's men are looking for me, and even if they weren't, a woman traveling alone in mining country attracts the wrong kind of attention. I need someone I can trust, someone who's hard work and isn't afraid of danger." Thomas felt as if the world had tilted on its axis. This morning he'd been a failed prospect with nothing to his name but a tired horse and some. Now he was being offered a chance at a fortune that could rival anything in the history of the American West. "What would be my share?" Trying to his voice. 50%. Equal partners in everything. I provide the location and the knowledge of how to extract the silver. You provide the muscle and the protection. Together, we take back what's rightfully mine and build something almost. Thomas had spent years breaking his back in other men's, earning barely enough to survive, while the owners grew rich from his labor. Now he was being offered an equal share in what could be the greatest silver strike in history. But something nagged at him. "Miss Donovan, forgive me for asking, but if this silver deposit is as valuable as you say, why offer me half? Surely you could find men willing to work for wages." Margaret's expression grew serious. "Because hired men work for whoever pays them the most, Mr. Hartley. Harold has deeper pockets than I do right now, and he's not the sort to hesitate when it comes to using violence to get what he wants. If he discovers the silver mine, he'll need workers to extract it. How long do you think hired men would remain loyal to me if Harold offered them more money? Or threatened them with violence?" "Exactly. But a partner, a true partner, has a stake in the success of the enterprise. More than that, they have a reason to keep the secret safe." Margaret leaned forward. "I'm not just offering you money, Mr. Hartley. I'm offering you a chance to build something lasting, something meaningful. Together we could develop that mine properly, safely, and profitably. We could create jobs for honest workers, build a town, maybe even establish a railroad spur to ship the ore out efficiently." Thomas found himself caught up in her vision. It wasn't just about the money, though the prospect of wealth was certainly it was about the chance to build something significant, to leave a mark on territory that would last beyond his lifetime. "There's something else," you continued. "My father didn't just discover the silver by accident. He was a geological engineer before he became a rancher. He studied the formations, the rock layers, the mineral deposits throughout this entire region. He believed, and I believe, that the mountain with the silver is just the beginning. There are likely other deposits throughout the area, deposits that haven't been discovered yet because no one has looked in the right places with the right knowledge." The implications were staggering. They weren't just talking about one mine, but potentially an entire mining district that could rival anything in Nevada or Colorado. "How soon could we reach the mine?" Thomas said. "That depends on how carefully we travel. It's about 60 miles from here, in some of the most remote country in the territory. The good news is that the same isolation that kept my father's secret safe will also provide us with cover. The bad news is that Harold's men are searching, and if they're smart, have figured out what kind of men are we talking about, ranch hands or worse. Harold hired a man named Jake Morrison to track me down. Morrison used to work for the Pinkertons before he went into business for him. He's not the type to give up easily, and he's not particular about his method. Thomas had heard of Morrison. The man had a reputation throughout the territory as someone who always got his target, regardless of whether they were wanted alive or dead. The fact that Harold had hired him suggested that Margaret's cousin was very serious about finding her. How much of a head start do we have? I'm not sure. I've been moving carefully, avoiding the main roads, sleeping rough. But Morrison is good at what he does. He could be a day behind us, or he could be a week. There's no way to know for certain. Thomas felt a familiar tightness in his chest, the same feeling he'd had as a soldier during the war when enemy troops were known to be in the area. But their exact location was unknown. It was the sensation of being hunted. "Miss Donovan," he said carefully, "I want you to know that I'm grateful for your offer, more grateful than I can express. But I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Of course. Are you certain that your father's mine is as valuable as you believe?" "I've seen men destroy their lives chasing dreams of easy wealth. I've done it myself. I don't want to put both of us in danger for something turn out to be fool's gold." Margaret smiled for the first time since he'd met her. "Mr. Hartley, I've been working that mine for 5 years. In that time, I've extracted enough silver to fund a 5-year court battle against one of the wealthiest men in California. Trust me when I say that there's nothing foolish about this particular gold." "Silver, silver," Margaret agreed with a chuckle. "Though at the prices silver is bringing these days, the distinction hardly matters." Thomas made his "Then accept your offer, Miss Donovan. Equal partner." They shook hands formally, and Thomas felt as if he'd just stepped across a threshold into an entirely different. Whatever happened from this point forward, nothing would ever be the. "There's one more thing," Margaret said as prepared to mount horses. "Once we reach the mine, we'll need to move quickly. I've been away for a week, and the longer the mine sits unworked, the greater the chance that someone will stumble across. Additionally, we'll need supplies, proper mining equipment, security measures, possibly some trusted workers. How do we get supplies without attracting attention?" "Very carefully. There's a town called Millfield about 20 miles south of the mine. It's small enough that strangers attract notice, but large enough to have the kind of supplies we'll need. We'll need to establish some kind of cover story for why we're there." Thomas considered this as they rode away from the river. "What if we posed as a married couple looking to start a small ranch? That would explain why we need supply, and it would provide a reason for you to be traveling with me." Margaret looked surprised by the suggestion, then thoughtful. "That actually might work, but are you comfortable with such a deception?" "It wouldn't be the first time I've had to bend the truth to survive," he admitted, "and if it keeps us safe and helps us achieve our goal, then I have no problem with it." As they traveled deeper into the afternoon, Margaret began to share more details about the mine and her father's operation. The picture that emerged was both fascinating and troubling. James Donovan had been a man of considerable foresight and planning, but he had also been deeply paranoid about security. He never trusted banks, Margaret. He converted most of the silver to coins and currency, then hid them in various locations throughout some of the hiding places I know about, others I don't. "How much money are we talking about?" "Conservative estimate? At least $200,000, possibly more." Thomas nearly fell off his horse. $200,000 was a fortune that could buy a small city. It was more money than most people would see in 10 lifetimes. "And that's in addition to the silver still in the mine?" he asked. "That's just what my father extracted over the years. The mine itself still contains enough silver to keep us busy for decades." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, both lost in their own thoughts. Thomas found himself thinking about what he would do with such wealth. The possibilities seemed endless. He could buy land, start his own business, maybe even return to his hometown in Ohio and help his family out of poverty. But he also found himself thinking about Margaret. There was something about her that went beyond the promise of shared wealth. She was intelligent, capable, and despite everything she'd been through, she maintained a dignity and strength that impressed him deeply. "Miss Donovan," he said eventually, "can I ask you something personal?" "Of course. Were you ever married?" "Really, I mean, not just for our cover story." Margaret was quiet for so long that Thomas began to think she wasn't going to answer. Finally, she spoke. "I was engaged once, about 10 years ago, to a man my father approved of, a fellow businessman from Denver. But when it came time for the wedding, I realized that he was more interested in marrying my father's daughter than in marrying me. He made it clear that he expected me to abandon my involvement in the family business and focus on being a proper wife and mother. And that didn't appeal to you? I have nothing against marriage or motherhood, but I wasn't willing to pretend to be helpless and ornamental when I knew I was capable of so much more. My father had spent years teaching me the business, preparing me to take over when I was gone. I wasn't about to throw that away for a man who saw me as nothing more than a pretty addition to his household. Thomas nodded appreciatively. Your father sounds like he was a wise man. He was. He always said that the greatest tragedy in the world was wasted potential. He believed that everyone, regardless of their background or gender, deserved the chance to make the most of their ability. What would he think of our partnership? Margaret considered this carefully. I think he would approve. He always judged people by their character rather than their circumstances. The fact that you shared your last piece of bread with a stranger would have meant a great deal to him. As the sun began to set, they found a secluded spot to make camp for the night. Thomas gathered firewood while Margaret prepared their simple meal from his remaining. It struck him how naturally they worked together, each anticipating what the other needed without having to. Tomorrow we'll reach Millfield, Margaret said as they sat around a small fire. We'll need to be very careful from that point on. Morrison might have men watching the town, or Harold might have sent word ahead to be on the lookout for. What's our covers? We're Thomas and Margaret Hartley. Margaret's hesitation. We've been married for 2 years, looking to start a small cattle ranch. We've been traveling from Montana, where my husband's previous ranch failed due to a harsh winter. Thomas raised an eyebrow. You've given this thought. The best lies are built on a foundation of truth. You really were involved in ranching before you turned to mining, weren't you? How did you know that? The way you handled your horse, the way you set up camp, the calluses on your hands. You have the instincts of someone who's spent time working cattle. Thomas was impressed by her observational skills. You're right. I worked on my uncle's ranch in Texas for several years before the war. After I came back, I tried to start my own operation, but I didn't have enough capital to make it work. Perfect. So our story has the ring of truth because it's mostly true. We just need to be consistent in our details. They spent the evening going over their cover story, making sure they both knew the same facts about their fictional marriage and their supposed ranching experience. Margaret proved to have a remarkable memory for detail and an intuitive understanding of how to craft a believable narrative. You would have made an excellent actress, Thomas observed. I've had plenty of practice hiding my true thoughts and feelings, Margaret of bitterness. When you're a woman in business, you learn to be whatever the situation requires. That night, as they slept on opposite sides of the dying fire, Thomas found himself staring up at the stars and marveling at the strange turn his life. 24 hours ago, he'd been a man with no prospects and no hope. Now he was potentially on the verge of unimaginable wealth, partnered with a woman who was proving to be far more remarkable than he'd initially realized. But he also couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times during the night, he thought he heard sounds in the darkness, the snap of a twig, the soft nicker. Each time he investigated, he found nothing, but the uneasy feeling persisted. When morning came, Margaret noticed his troubled expression immediately. You didn't sleep well? I kept thinking I heard something in the darkness. Probably just my imagination, but we should assume it wasn't your imagination. Morrison is very good at what he does, and one of his skills is being able to track people without being detected. They broke camp quickly and efficiently, both of them now acutely aware that they might be being followed. As they rode toward Millfield, Thomas found himself constantly checking their back trail, looking for any sign of pursuit. How well do you know Morrison? Thomas asked as they rode. I've never met him personally, but I've heard stories. He served in the war, same as you probably did. Afterward, he worked for the Pinkertons, tracking down train robbers and cattle thieves. He left them about 5 years ago to start his own agency. Why did he leave the Pinkertons? I understood too willing to use permanent solutions to temporary problems. Even the Pinkertons. If Harold had hired a man who was too violent for the Pinkertons, then they were dealing with someone truly dangerous. How much is Harold paying him? Thomas asked. I don't know for certain, but probably at least $1,000, maybe more. Dead or alive? Margaret was quiet. Knowing Harold, probably dead. A corpse can't contest a will or make inconvenient claims about family property. They reached the outskirts of Millfield around midday. The town was exactly as Margaret had, large enough to have the say needed, but small enough that strangers, as they rode down the main street, could feel eyes watching from windows. Remember? were newlywed at a ranch. Thomas nodded and helped Margaret, playing the part of the attendant. As he did, he noticed a man, the street, who seemed to be paying them unusual attention. The man was tall and lean, with the kind of alert stillness Thomas recognized. Professional gunfighter. We might have a problem. I see him. Let's get our supplies and get out of here as quickly as. They entered the general store and began gathering the items they would need: food, ammunition, basic mining tools, and camping supplies. The storekeeper was friendly enough, asking the usual questions about where they were from and what brought them to the area. Margaret handled the conversation skillfully, sticking to their cover story while gradually drawing out information about the local area. "You folks thinking of settling around here permanent?" the storekeeper asked. "We're considering it. My husband and I are looking for good grazing land, maybe something with water access. Well, there's plenty of open range in these parts. Of course, most of the good land is already claimed by the big outfit. Donovan Holdings owns most everything north of here." Thomas saw Margaret's jaw touch slightly at the mention of her family name, but she maintained her composure. "Donovan Holdings, innocent. Oh yes, one of the biggest operations in the territory. Old James Donovan built quite an empire before he passed on. His daughter took over for a while, but I hear tell she's had some legal troubles recently. New ownership now, I believe." "That's unfortunate for her," Margaret said carefully. "Well, I suppose that's the way of the world. A woman's got no business trying to run an operation that size anyway. Takes a man's hand to manage something like that properly." Thomas saw Margaret's eyes flash dangerously, but she managed to keep her voice level. "I'm sure you're right." They completed their purchases and loaded their supplies onto their horses. As they prepared to leave, the suspicious man from across the street began walking in their direction. "Time to go, Thomas." They mounted quickly and rode out of town at a pace that put distance between them and the stranger, but not so fast to appear panicked. Once they were out of sight of the town, Thomas looked back and saw dust rising from the road behind them. "We're being followed." "How many?" Margaret asked. "Hard to say from the dust. At least 2, maybe more." Margaret made a quick decision. "There's a trail about a mile ahead that leads up into the hills. If we can reach it before they see which direction we went, we might be able to." They pushed their horses harder, racing toward the turnoff. Margaret. Behind them, the dust cloud was getting. Just as they reached the trail, Thomas caught a glimpse of their pursuers, 3 men on horseback, riding hard. "Did they see us turn?" Margaret asked. "They climbed into the hills?" "I don't think so, but we can't count on it." The trail was narrow and winding, clearly designed for pack animals rather than riders. Their horses picked their way carefully over the rocky ground while Margaret led them higher into the mountain. "Where does this trail lead?" Thomas asked. "Eventually to the mine," Margaret replied. "But first, we need to lose our followers." They rode for another hour, climbing steadily into increasingly rugged terrain. Several times Thomas dismounted to check their back trail, but he saw no sign of pursuit. Either they had successfully evaded their followers, or the men were very good at being hidden. "There's a place ahead where we can rest the horses and see if anyone is following us." The place she referred to turned out to be a natural overlook that provided a commanding view of the valley below. They dismounted and let their horses drink from a small stream, while Thomas used his field glass to scan the terrain behind them. "I don't see anything," after several minutes of careful observation. "That doesn't mean they're not there," Margaret warned. "Morrison is capable of tracking us without being seen." "How much farther to the mine?" "About 6 hours if we stick to the trails, less if we're willing to take some risks." Thomas weighed their options. They could take the safer route and risk being caught by their pursuers, or they could take shortcuts through dangerous terrain and risk their horses or their own necks. "What kind of risks are we talking about?" "There's a pass about 2 miles from here that cuts directly toward the mine. It's steep and narrow, and if a horse goes lame, or if the weather turns, we could find ourselves trapped. But it would cut at least 3 hours off our travel time." "Let's take the pass," Thomas. "If Morrison is as good as you say, he'll track us eventually, regardless of which route we take. Better to reach the mine as quickly as possible." They remounted and continued climbing. The terrain became increasingly treacherous as they gained altitude. The trail, if it could even be called a trail, was barely wide enough for a single horse, with steep drops on one side and sheer rock walls on the other. "How did your father ever find this place?" Thomas asked, as they carefully negotiated a particularly dangerous section. "He was looking for something else entirely," Margaret replied. "He was surveying for a possible railroad route when he discovered the silver." "Pure luck, really?" The pass Margaret had mentioned turned out to be a narrow gap between two towering peaks. As they approached it, Thomas could see why she had warned him about the risk. The path through the pass was barely visible, carved into the rock face like a scar. Sure about this? No, Margaret admitted, but I'm sure that Morrison will kill us both if he catches us. That's a certainty. The pass is only a risk. They began the treacherous journey through the gap, leading their horses on foot where the path was too narrow or too steep to ride. The wind whistled through the pass with an almost human voice, and Thomas found himself fighting the urge to look over his shoulder every few steps. Halfway through the pass, Margaret's horse stumbled on a loose rock. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if the animal might fall over the edge, but Margaret managed to steady it and guide it to safer footing. That was close, Thomas. Too close. But we're almost through. When they finally emerged from the pass onto a small plateau, both of them were shaking from exhaustion and relief. The plateau offered another commanding view of the surrounding terrain, and Thomas immediately began scanning for some pursuit. Still nothing, he reported. Good. From here, it's only about 2 hours to the mine, and the terrain is much easier. As they rested, Thomas found himself studying Margaret with new respect. She had navigated the dangerous pass with the skill and confidence of someone who had done it many times before. More than that, she had made the difficult decision to take the risky route without hesitation, weighing the alternatives and choosing the option that gave them the best chance of. Miss Donovan, I have to admit something to you. When I first offered to help you, I thought I was being gallant, maybe even a little. I thought you were a lady in distress who needed protecting. I realize now that I was wrong. You don't need protecting. What you needed was a partner, and I'm honored that you chose me. Margaret smiled, and the first time since he'd met her, the expression reached her eye. Thank you. That means more to me than you know. The final approach to the mine took them through a landscape that seemed almost alien in its stark beauty. Towering rock formations jutted from the earth like ancient monuments, and the vegetation was sparse, twisted by the harsh conditions. It was easy to see why this area had remained unexplored for so long. It looked like the sort of place where nothing survived. There, Margaret said finally, pointing to what appeared to be just another rock fall. The mine entrance is hidden behind those boulders. As they got closer, Thomas could see that what had appeared to be a natural was actually a carefully constructed camouflage. Someone had arranged rocks and debris to completely hide the entrance to what was obviously a significant mining op. Your father was thorough, he had to be. If word of this discovery had gotten out, this place would have been overrun within weeks. Instead, he was able to work it quietly for nearly 15 years. Margaret led him around the entrance, a small cabin that was similar. Inside, Thomas was amazed to discover a fully equipped mining op, tools, scales, smelting equipment, even a small laboratory testing ore samples. This is incredible. Running his hands over the sophisticated, your father must have invested a fortune in setting this up. He did, but as you can see, it paid off. Margaret showed him the mine entrance, secured with a heavy iron door like it could withstand a cannon. When she opened it, Thomas was hit by a cool breeze carrying the distinctive metallic scent of silver ore. How deep does it go, he asked. We've excavated about 300 feet into the mountain, following the main vein, but that's just the beginning. My father's surveys indicated that the silver deposits extend much deeper and in several different directions. Thomas peered into the darkness of the mine shaft, trying to imagine the wealth that lay hidden in the rock. It was almost impossible to comprehend. What's our first priority? Security? We need to establish some kind of early warning system in case Morrison or Harold's other men manage to track us here. After that, we can focus on extraction. They spent the remainder of the afternoon setting up a defensive perimeter around the mine site. Margaret showed Thomas several provided excellent views of the various approaches to the area, and they established a system of signals that would allow them to communicate silently, if necessary. That evening, as they sat in the cabin sharing another simple meal, Thomas found himself reflecting on the remarkable series of events that had brought him to this place. Less than 48 hours ago, he had shared his bread with a stranger. Now he was sitting in a hidden mine with millions of dollars, planning a partnership to change both of their lives. Margaret, it's the first time he had used her first name. I need to ask you something. Dee, what is it? Why did you really choose me as your partner? I mean, the real reason, beyond the fact that I shared my bread with you. Margaret was quiet for a long time, staring into the flames of their small fire. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer than he had ever heard it. "Do you remember what I told you about my former fiancé? How he saw me as ornamental rather than capable?" "Yes. For most of my life that's how men have seen me, either as a pretty decoration or as a threat to be eliminated. Even the men who worked for my father, men who had known me for years, always seemed surprised when I demonstrated knowledge or competence." She paused. "But when you looked at me by the river, when I told you my story, you didn't see me as either helpless or threatening. You saw me as a person with a problem that needed solving. You offered to help, not because you felt sorry, but because it was the right thing to do." Thomas felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "And more than that," Margaret continued, "when I told you about the mine, about the partnership I was offering, you didn't immediately try to take charge or assume that you should be the senior partner because you're a man. You accepted that we would be equal." "We are equal," Thomas said simply. "Yes," Margaret agreed, meeting his eyes across the fire. "We are, and that's rarer than you might think." They sat in comfortable silence, both lost in their own thought. Finally, Thomas spoke again. "Margaret, can I ask you something else?" "Of course. What happens after we've secured the mine and dealt with the Morrison problem? What's our long-term plan?" "I've been thinking of. We have an opportunity here to do something really significant, Tom. Not just to get rich, but to build something lasting and meaningful." "What do you have in mind?" "A town," Margaret said, her eyes lighting up with enthusiasm. "A real town, built around proper mining operations. We could establish claims throughout this entire mountain range, hire honest workers, create jobs for families. We could build schools, churches, maybe even attract the railroad." Thomas found himself caught up in her vision. It would take years to develop something like that. The best things always do. But imagine what we could accomplish. We could prove that mining operations can be run ethically, that workers can be treated fairly, still generate substantial. We could show that a woman and a man can be true partners in business. "You really think I think we can do anything we set our minds." Margaret, "Separately, we're both capable people. Together, we could be unstoppable." As Thomas prepared for sleep that night, he found himself thinking about the future Margaret had described. It was an ambitious dream, perhaps even an impossible one, but for the first time in years, he felt genuinely excited about what tomorrow might bring. He was awakened before dawn by a sound that made his blood run cold, the distant whinny of a horse that wasn't theirs. "Margaret!" urgently. She came alert immediately, her hand instinctively reaching for the rifle she kept nearby. "How many?" "I don't know yet. At least one horse, maybe more." They moved quickly and silently to one of their observation where Thomas used field glasses to scan the approaches. In the gray light of dawn, he could make out 3 figures on horseback, moving carefully, steadily toward their possession grimly. "I recognized his horse." "How did he find us?" "He's very good at what he does. We probably left more of a trail than we realized." Thomas studied the approaching men through his glasses. They were still at least a mile away, picking their way carefully through the rocky terrain. "How much do they know about this place?" "Morrison might know about the mine's existence, but he shouldn't know about the specific location or the layout. That gives us an advantage." "What's the plan?" Margaret was quiet for clearly thinking through their options. "We can't outrun them. They'll just track us again. And we can't hide indefinitely. They'll eventually find us. That leaves us with one option." "We fight, Thomas. We fight," Margaret confirmed. "But we fight smart. We know this terrain, and they don't. We have defensive positions, and they have to approach across open ground." They spent the next hour preparing their defenses, positioning ammunition and supplies at strategic points around the mines. Margaret proved surprisingly knowledgeable about military tactics, suggesting improvements to Thomas's that he hadn't considered. "Where did you learn about warfare?" "Books, and I spent a lot of time listening to my father's stories of the war. He always said that knowledge was power, regardless of whether you expected to use it." As the sun rose higher, Morrison and his men drew closer. Through his field glasses, Thomas could see that all 3 were heavily armed and had the look of experienced fighters. This wasn't going to be easy. "The one on the left is probably Jake Morrison," Margaret said, taking her own look through the glasses. "The other 2 are likely hired guns. Harold probably promised them a substantial bonus if they brought back proof by death. Any regrets about trusting a stranger by the river to lighten? Margaret smiled grimly. None whatsoever. Even if this doesn't end well, it's better than spending the rest of my life running and hiding. The final confrontation began with Morrison calling out from a position about 300 yards away. Miss Donovan, his voice echoed off the surrounding rocks. I know you're in there. Mr. Harold Donovan has authorized me to make you a generous offer. Margaret and Thomas exchanged glances. What kind of offer? Margaret called back. Safe passage out of the territory in exchange for information about any unofficial Brete assets that might have belonged to your father. He wants to know about the mine, Thomas murmured. Of course he does, Margaret. Harold's probably starting to realize that the legal assets he inherited aren't generating the income he expected. What's your answer, Miss Donovan? Morrison called. My answer, Margaret shouted back, is that Harold can go to hell. This mine belongs to me, and I'm not giving it up without a fight. There was a long pause. Then Morrison's voice came again, colder this time. I was hoping you'd be reasonable, Miss Donovan. Now we'll have to do this the hard way. The attack began with gunfire from multiple directions as Morrison's men tried to pin them down while advancing their position. Thomas and Margaret responded from their defensive position, using their knowledge of the terrain to stay mobile and avoid being targeted. The battle raged for nearly an hour, with neither side able to gain a decisive advantage. Morrison's men were experienced fighters, but they were attacking uphill against entrenched defenders who knew every rock and crevice in the area. Finally, Thomas managed to work his way around to a flanking position where he could get a clear shot at one of Morrison's men. His rifle cracked and toppled from his horse out of the fight. That's one down, Thomas called to Margaret, but the victory was short-lived. Morrison and his remaining partner began a coordinated advance, using covering fire to get closer to the mine entrance. Thomas realized that if they reached the defensive perimeter, the superior numbers and close-quarters fighting experience would give them a decisive advantage. Margaret, he called, they're getting too close. We need to fall back to the secondary position. They began a fighting retreat toward the mine entrance, using the rocky terrain to provide cover. But Morrison was pressing them hard, clearly determined to end this confrontation one way or another. Just as it seemed that Morrison might succeed in overrunning their position, Thomas heard something that changed everything, the sound of multiple horses approaching at a gallop. Who the hell is that? Morrison, his attention momentarily. Thomas used his field glasses to scan the new arrivals. What he saw made him smile for the first time in hours. Margaret, look! A group of 6 riders was approaching the mine site, and Thomas recognized several of them from his description of local ranchers. More importantly, they were flying a flag that indicated they were operating under some kind of official authority. It's Sheriff Coleman from Canyon Creek, Margaret said excitedly, and those are some of the ranch foremen who worked for my father. Morrison realized that his situation had just become untenable. Outnumbered and facing official law enforcement, he made the smart tactical decision to withdraw. Within minutes, he and his remaining partner had disappeared into the rocky maze of the surrounding hills. Sheriff Coleman rode up to their position, his hat in his hand. Miss Donovan, are you all right? I'm fine, Sheriff. Thanks to my partner here, Mr. Thomas Hartley. The sheriff shook Thomas's hand firmly. Glad to meet you, Mr. Hartley. Sorry we didn't get here sooner. We've been tracking Morrison and his men for 2 days. How did you know to look for us here? Margaret asked. Got a telegram from a judge in San Francisco, Coleman explained. Seems there's been some new developments in your legal situation, Miss Donovan. That court ruling that gave your cousin control of your father's estate has been overturned. Margaret stared at him. Overturned? How? Turns out your cousin made a mistake when he bribed them. He did it in writing, and someone turned the evidence over to the federal authorities. A judge had arrested, and all of his recent rulings are being reviewed. Your case was one of the first to be overturned. Thomas felt a surge of joy and relief. Not only had they survived Morrison's attack, but Margaret's legal troubles were over. There's more, Sheriff. Your cousin Harold has been arrested on charges of bribery and conspiracy. Seems he made enemies in San Francisco with his heavy-handed tactic. Margaret sat down heavily on a nearby rock, overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. So it's over? Really over? Yes, ma'am. You're legally entitled to all of your father's property again, and that includes this mine, assuming it's on land that was originally part of your father's holdings. Thomas and Margaret exchanged glances. Their partnership was still valid, but now they wouldn't have to worry about Harold or Morrison or any legal challenges to their operation. "Sheriff," Margaret said finally, "I'd like you to meet my business partner, Thomas Hartley. We're planning to develop this mine and possibly establish a town in this area." Sheriff Coleman was surprised. "A town? Out here? Why not? The mineral deposits in this area are extensive enough to support a substantial population, and Miss Donovan and I have some ideas about how to do it right." Over the next several hours, as they shared their story with Sheriff Coleman and his men, Thomas marveled at how completely they had gone from being hunted fugitives to legitimate business owners with the backing of local law enforcement. "There is one more thing. The federal authorities are very interested in talking to you about your cousin's activities. They think he might have been involved in other illegal schemes, and they'd like your help in investigating them." "I'll cooperate fully," Margaret said. "Harold caused a lot of pain for a lot of people. If I can help bring him to justice, I will." As the sheriff and his men rode away, Thomas and Margaret found themselves alone at the mine site for the first time since Morrison's attack. The silence felt strange the mornings. "So, what now?" Margaret looked around at them. "Now we get to work. We have a mine to do, a town to build." "Equal partners?" Thomas asked. "Equal partners," Margaret. They shook hands again, but this time it felt different. This wasn't just a business agreement between strangers anymore. This was a partnership between two people who had faced danger together and come out stronger on the other side. As the sun set behind the mountains, Thomas reflected on the incredible journey that had brought him to this point. He had shared his bread with a dusty woman by the river, not knowing that she owned half the county. But more than that, he had found something he hadn't even known he was looking for: a partner, an equal, someone who saw the world the same way he did and wanted to build something meaningful. The mine would make them wealthy, certainly, but the partnership they forged would make them something even more valuable. It would make them unstoppable. 6 months later, the town of Donovan's Creek was officially incorporated, with Thomas Hartley as mayor and Margaret Donovan as the chief economic development. The silver mine was producing steadily, providing jobs for over 100 workers and their families. A school had been built, a church was under construction, and there was serious talk of a railroad spur that would connect them to the main line. And every evening, as Thomas and Margaret sat on the porch of the house they had built overlooking the town, Thomas remembered that moment by the river when he had made the simple decision to share his bread with a stranger. It had been such a small act, requiring no great courage or sacrifice. But sometimes, Thomas reflected, the smallest acts of kindness can change everything.